Bloomberg Audio Studios. Podcasts, radio, news.
This is Bloomberg Businessweek Daily, reporting from the magazine that helps global leaders stay ahead, with insight on the people, companies, and trends shaping today's complex economy, plus global business, finance, and tech news as it happens. The Bloomberg Businessweek Daily podcast with Carol Massar and Tim Stenovec on Bloomberg Radio.
It's Friday. Talks aimed at de-escalating the week-long war between Israel and Iran got underway in Geneva today. This is after U.S. President Donald Trump signaled he would give diplomacy a chance before deciding whether to intervene militarily. Now, oil prices did fall following a report from Reuters earlier that Iran is ready to discuss limitations on uranium enrichment, but will not consider stopping entirely while it's under military attacks. And Tim, we know that these attacks have continued.
Yeah, for the latest, let's head to Jerusalem, where we find Bloomberg News reporter Dan Williams joining us from there just after 9 p.m. in the evening. Dan, when we spoke to you earlier this week, you were in London. You told us that you weren't expecting to be in London that long. You've obviously made it back to Jerusalem. The airport does not have normal traffic right now. Difficult to get in and out. Just give us an idea of how you made it back from London to Jerusalem.
Hi, good afternoon. Yes, as you noted, the airspace is closed around Israel, not just Israel. Other countries in the Middle East are also taking that precaution, given how busy the airspace is with warplanes and missiles going back and forth. The Israelis have started opening up the skies, but only for select returning Israelis. There's some 100 to 150,000 of them abroad. So basically, as a workaround, I was sent back overland through Egypt, flown from London to Sharm el-Sheikh, which is a famous resort on the Red Sea in the Egyptian Sinai. It added a number of hours to the trip. Overall, a pleasant trip. There are a few hiccups there, but that's pretty much what we're seeing across the board. Overland travel through Egypt, through Jordan, back and forth by those who are unable or unwilling, perhaps, to take what limited air options there are right now.
Sounds pretty difficult and pretty tricky. Having gotten back home, I'm assuming it was pretty difficult to see some of what was around you, but tell us about what is life like in Jerusalem today?
Well, since you asked, I'll share with you. A couple hours ago, we actually had sirens across the country. There was a volley of some 30 missiles from Iran. They set off as a precaution the Israeli sirens everywhere, and I got to join my family in the communal bomb shelter, a place I hadn't experienced previously, along with a number of neighbors, some of whom I hadn't met previously. But that really has been the daily experience here across the country, certainly in my neighborhood and in my block, including in the early hours of the night when some of these attacks have taken place. Basically, a very sophisticated early alert system that gives you a few minutes to organize yourself, and then when the sirens sound to tell you that the missiles are in course potentially to strike where you are, that gives you a few more seconds, a couple more minutes to find shelter in a bomb shelter. People aren't taking chances. They might have taken shelter at home previously. They're all going to these underground shelters provided by the municipality, by the country, because as we've seen, the destruction wrought by those missiles that have managed to penetrate Israel's air defenses has been substantial.
Dan, I'm wondering about, not just anecdotally, but what the numbers tell us about Israeli citizens who have been mobilized to serve in this specific conflict versus just the ongoing war in Gaza. Obviously, there's been a lot of disruption to the economy. As a result, we're Bloomberg. We focus on the numbers. We look at the economies a lot here and get an understanding of what the bigger impacts of these events can be. What can you tell us about just Israeli citizenry right now? Who has been called up to serve? What has been disrupted? Just give us an idea.
That's an excellent question. But it's worth remembering this Israeli-Iranian war is not just a war in its own right. It's actually the culmination, the cresting of a more than 2-month-old war that began with the Hamas attack on Israel on October 7th, 2023. You'll recall that in the early days of that war, we're talking more than 20 months ago now, Israel enlisted some 300,000 reservists that were mobilized. That took a big chunk out of the economy. You literally saw shops shutting down, entire malls, not just as a precaution against rocket attacks, but simply because shops were short-staffed. Anyone between the age of 21, 35 had a very good chance of being in uniform at that point. Many people leaving their families behind, their careers, and that was very disruptive. As that war made progress, Gaza was largely overrun. Many of those soldiers were demobbed, allowed to return home. This war with Iran is mainly being fought by the Air Force, which you can assume is fully mobilized. We're talking 200 warplanes just in the first wave, dozens of warplanes every day in various places, and not just Iran. We've had airstrikes in Gaza today and in Lebanon, potentially patrols in Syria as well. I don't have the numbers for Air Force deployment, whether it's standing military or reservists. I know it's probably lower than the ground forces, which have been deployed in far smaller numbers. There are 4 divisions now active in Gaza. And of course, there's Home Front Command, which is basically a military version of a civil defense force. Its responsibility is to handle emergencies on the home front, dig people out of rubble, provide first aid and such.
Dan, U.S. President Donald Trump signaled he would give diplomacy a chance before deciding whether to intervene militarily in the war between Israel and Iran. How is that being received there?
Well, if you notice the mood music from Israeli statements since that announcement was made by the White House, there's a tendency among Israelis who've commented on this to perhaps try to persuade the president to decide in favor of military intervention, at least when it comes to bombing Fordow, the famous now deep underground uranium enrichment site the Iranians have. It's so deep underground in a mountain that Israeli firepower may not be enough to reach it. It may be a job that can be left only to the American Air Force with the famous mother of all bombs, 30,000 pounds that would be dropped from a B-2. And I think the Israelis openly want that to happen. Failing that, they say they can manage the job alone. It's a difficult job, but they say they can manage it alone. The question is how long the Iranians can keep up their retaliatory missile attacks. It would appear those are tapering off. Today we had something in the order, as I said, of 30 missiles, whereas in the opening weekend, 5 days ago, it was an average of about 100 missiles on every 24-hour cycle. So that seems to be dropping off, the Israelis say, as a result of their preemptive attacks against launchers. I think we will know more at the end of this weekend, especially as the Iranians are apparently holding stopgap talks with European powers now in Geneva, perhaps to find a way back to diplomacy, which would satisfy Trump, indirectly satisfy Israel, and perhaps bring this story to a close.
Dan, you mentioned that if the U.S. does not get involved with the massive 30,000-pound bunker buster bomb, Israel could handle this itself. How would they do that? What's the reporting telling you?
Obviously, there's strict military secrecy. I don't know. But the Israelis insist, including skeptical ex-generals who say they've been briefed on this, that it is possible. The 2 things that come to mind are A, simply sustained bombing at one side. It's worth remembering back in September, Israel killed the chief of Nasrallah, the chief of Hezbollah, Hassan Nasrallah. He was in a bunker underneath a residential building, by then largely vacated, something like 20 meters underground with a multi-story building above him. What the Israelis did was drop 54 bombs, bomb after bomb after bomb, basically deepening the crater until he was reached. In theory, the same thing could be done, but on a much larger scale, much more sustained. With Fordow, keep in mind the Israelis say they have complete dominance of the Iranian skies. So in theory, there'd be no problem with them going back and forth with their smaller airplanes, smaller delivery payloads, and simply do it for days and perhaps weeks until they crack that nut. The other possibility is a ground forces operation, commandos who would penetrate it and literally go floor to floor, destroying anything they come across, blowing up, engaging whatever personnel there are down there. Right. There is a precedent also from last summer where Israel did this with an underground Hezbollah facility in Syria. That might serve as a tactful precedent.
All right, Dan, going to leave it there. We know it's late there in Jerusalem. Appreciate being able to touch base with you. Do stay safe, thinking about you, your family, and certainly your community. Bloomberg News reporter Dan Williams there in Jerusalem.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Businessweek Daily podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. Or watch us live on YouTube.
And folks, it is an economy battered by years of trade embargoes, sanctions, and an endemic mismanagement. We're talking about Iran. And that Israeli and Western intelligence assessment seen by Bloomberg suggested that the war could lead to an economic collapse in Iran and inflation of 80%, if not higher. Now, according to this report, it would likely result in social discontent and challenging of the stability of the ruling regime, Tim.
Yeah, we wanted to talk really about the daily existence of Iranians right now and how it shifted really over the last 50 or so years, specifically the last 15 years. The challenges about life in Iran for its citizens who are currently under attack, their challenges, and what they're experiencing. To help us understand that, Alex Vatanka is back with us, senior fellow at Middle East Institute. It's an organization with the mission to, quote, increase knowledge of the Middle East among citizens of the U.S. and to promote a better understanding between the people of these two areas. The organization has received funding from various sources, including corporations, foundations, and various Middle Eastern governments such as the UAE and Qatar, as well as the U.S. government. Alex joins us once again from Washington, D.C. Alex, we've spoken to our reporters on the ground in Israel. We haven't been able to do the same for people on the ground in Tehran and other parts of Iran. We wanted to speak with you. You were born there. You're still in touch with people throughout the country. Can you give us an understanding of what life is like day to day right now?
Tim and Carol, great to be back with you. Look, you're right. I mean, obviously that's my day job, trying to track what's going on in the country of Iran. But the last few days actually been very hard. With some exceptions, internet is essentially no longer accessible. The authorities believe the Israelis are using access to the internet for their operations against the Iranian regime. The other way of looking at it is maybe the Iranian authorities are concerned about public mobilization. There is for sure a lot of messaging going into Iran from the large Iranian diaspora, which is vastly anti-regime. So there's a very lively debate outside of Iran among Iranians across the world that what would be best for the country. There are those who are saying regime change is the opportunity right now, but there are also many who are skeptical and saying, actually, we don't know if regime change is the outcome. It could be civil war. It could be something worse. So let's take it easy here.
Well, Alex, what I want to also do is take a step back. And what has life been like under the Ayatollah, who has been reigning for some 36 years? What has life been like for Iranians before this attack?
So, Carol, I mean, let me just remind everybody that Iran had a revolution in 1979, and Ayatollah Khomeini and his people, including the one who's the supreme leader today, Khamenei, took over. And if you ask the 75% of Iranians who were born after that revolution, they will tell you life has not been pretty because it's been a very repressive regime across the board. It's been domestically repressive, and it's been very adventurous, ideological, stubborn in terms of its foreign policy. I mean, the reason why we're seeing this war happen, and again, let's put aside if Israel was justified to attack Iran or not last week, that's a separate issue. But the fact is, this Islamic Republic for so long has been sort of taunting the Israelis, saying you don't have a right to exist and so on. So a lot of Iranians are asking, we don't like what Israel's doing to Iran right now, but at the same time, you're not exactly innocent. You asked for this. You taunted them. So life.
Well, I guess but what is life like? What does the average Iranian make? What is their existence like in terms of a home, food on the table? What is that like?
So it's a medium-sized economy. I mean, it should have been a top 20 economy if they weren't under sanctions. They should be the size of Turkey, if not bigger, because Iran, unlike Turkey, is a lot of oil and gas. So very educated population of 90 million, pretty significant industrial base, agricultural base. Again, a lot of, parts of the economy. I mean, the idea that oil is not true. It's much more multifaceted than that. But sanctions have really had a great impact on life. So one of the headlines for your average Iranian in terms of life is there are no jobs. Inflation is rampant. There's repression. There is isolation. So what do a lot of Iranians do? They look for a way out. Immigration has become basically the way out. That's why you have this large diaspora around the world. Not because people want to leave their homes, but because the opportunities just don't exist in Iraq.
What has been the resistance to the government, and how has that proliferated or not since 2009?
There's always been resistance going back to 1979. Has it been always an effective resistance? That's the big question mark. To this day, we have a large Iranian political opposition, but it's not united. There's a lot of energy there, but they haven't agreed on an agenda in terms of the day after. So you have the Shah's son, who is obviously very well known here in the United States. He's on TV quite a bit. He is the most prominent figure. He has an agenda. He wants to sort of transition Iran out of the Islamic Republic into something else. I have heard him personally many times. I think he's got some great ideas. I do have question marks whether he can unify the diaspora in terms of the day after in Iran. I have also the question in terms of whether he can unify the folks in Iran. I mean, that's where the battle is going to be. It's not the diaspora. It's those 90 million Iranians. Where are they going to go? Who will lead them? That's the big question mark ahead for the opposition.
The reason I asked specifically about 2009 is because of the protests following the election in Iran, the presidential election. And my understanding has been that there has not really been there was a sense of unification there, but that was pretty quickly quashed. And since then, nothing really has emerged.
So 2009 is not the only time, Tim, that people came to the streets. You have many other examples going back to 99 and even before. 2009 was significant for a couple of reasons. One, it happened 2 years before the Arab Spring. So the Iranians were ahead of the Arabs in terms of coming out in the streets. But the other part of the 2009 uprising in Iran was because part of the regime came to the street. So it wasn't just people from the street, ordinary Iranians. It was part of the regime that came out against, back then in that election, Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, if you remember that fella. But in 2009, you've had plenty of protests. I mean, the largest ones just happened a few years ago in 2022 with the Mahsa Amini, the young Iranian woman who was killed just because she wasn't wearing her headscarf, which is by law mandatory in Iran. She was killed for that, which, by the way, just raises another issue. Imagine living in a society where you can't decide what your dress code will be. So this is a regime that's lost its people a long time ago. The question is, do they have time to catch up? They're desperately trying to play the nationalist card. I wonder if it's too late, if they can stay in power.
What do the people want? And what does the region want? And forgive me, but just got about 40 seconds here. What kind of an Iran do they want going forward?
Yeah, no, I mean, that's a no-brainer. People want the end of the Islamic Republic. That's a no-brainer. And I think that's true for the rest of the region. Nobody wants the Islamic Republic. The big question mark is at what cost? And can it be done in a different way other than bombs dropping on their heads? Because people remember Iraq, they remember other cases of civil wars in the region. So that's the big challenge for American policymakers, Europeans, and others who are trying to steer this situation forward.
If the U.S. doesn't get more involved, can better change come to Iran? Again, just got about 20 seconds.
Big question mark. But look, my bottom line is this. It's for the people of Iran to decide their destiny. U.S. can help them, but U.S. right now, I don't see the appetite getting involved in a big way.
All right, going to leave it there. Alex, thanks so much. Have a good weekend. Safe one. Alex Vadanka, he's senior fellow at the Middle East Institute. When we come back, check on...
This is the Bloomberg Businessweek Daily Podcast. Listen live each weekday starting at 2 p.m. Eastern on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app. You can also listen live on Amazon Alexa from our flagship New York station. Just say, Alexa, play Bloomberg 1130.
As the world awaits to see what happens in terms of the U.S. role in the war between Israel and Iran, whether or not there will be more of a role. The latest evidence from the ground does suggest that they would need to significantly escalate attacks if they want to eradicate the Islamic Republic's nuclear capabilities. Now, satellite images, there's this incredible story on the Bloomberg. Highly recommend that you check it out on the Bloomberg terminal or at Bloomberg.com. But these satellite images essentially, Tim, show that atomic installations were only grazed after 4 days of bombardment.
The Israel-Iran conflict comes down largely to nuclear capabilities. Who has it, who wants it, and perhaps who needs it to keep world order without actually disrupting it. With us is John Erath, Senior Policy Director for the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. It's a nonpartisan nonprofit that's dedicated to reducing and eventually eliminating the threats posed by nuclear, chemical, and biological weapons through congressional engagement and public education. John, good to have you with us this afternoon. Appreciate you joining us on the program. Your specialty is thinking about these weapons in the context of getting rid of them. And I'm wondering, over your career, where we are given a world, in a world right now, when it comes to non-proliferation of these weapons.
Well, it's a mixed story. Since the Cold War, about 80% of the nuclear weapons that ever existed have been eliminated. But right now we see the pendulum swinging a little bit in the other direction, where the nuclear weapons are given a little bit more currency, where you see proliferators such as North Korea and Iran putting more emphasis on possessing those weapons and giving a little more importance to them. So what is going to happen in the next few weeks and months, particularly with regard to Iran, is going to have a significant impact on how these weapons are viewed in the future and what the world is going to look like and how the world is going to think about them.
You know, my follow-up was going to be, but I feel like you've answered it. You know, are we indeed on the cusp of what could be a very, very serious turn for the worse when it comes to nuclear proliferation? It sounds like you are saying yes, depending on how this plays out.
Absolutely. If Iran is allowed to acquire nuclear weapons, if they're perceived coming out of this conflict as becoming significant in the currency of international politics, then there are going to be other governments that are going to want to follow suit. There's also the case of Russia and Ukraine. Russia has been using threats of nuclear weapons to advance its objectives regarding Ukraine, particularly with the nuclear blackmail that it has been conducting. It's been making threats with nuclear weapons pretty much every Tuesday since the war in Ukraine began in 2022 to keep Western nations from supplying arms and ammunition to Ukraine, to withhold, to limit what they supply to the Ukrainians. And it's been very effective. Countries such as North Korea are paying attention to this, and they're looking for their own means of nuclear blackmail. If Russia comes out of this war perceived as having succeeded in attaining its objectives through nuclear blackmail, other countries, starting with Kim Jong-un, are going to take notice.
Okay. And forgive me if this sounds naive. The U.S. is the only nation, right, to have ever actually used nuclear warfare, weapons, I should say, in warfare. So having said that, why is it, again, forgive if this sounds naive, but why is the U.S. allowed to have nuclear weapons and other nations versus an Iran or North Korea? Is it just because we believe in the control and the safety and that they actually won't be used, considering the U.S. has been the only one who used it? Like, help me understand this.
I think if you ask that question of a number of different U.S. leaders, you would get a number of different answers. I used to work for the U.S. government, and my answer would be that having used nuclear weapons, I think that I would say that speaking for the U.S., I would say I would wish that we hadn't. And having nuclear weapons, I would say that I would hope that the U.S. would never be in a position to use them again. The official U.S. nuclear policy, as expressed in the Nuclear Posture Review that was done most recently by the Biden administration, but basically repeating language from the Trump administration and from every administration previous to that, was that the U.S. nuclear weapons are for defense and deterrence, not for offensive use, but basically to protect against somebody else using nuclear weapons against us. And that has been very much the policy of U.S. administration since the Cold War.
And we should remind everyone who's listening, we're talking about John Areth, Senior Policy Director for the Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation. It's a nonpartisan nonprofit. John has worked with the government some 30 years in arms control and non-proliferation, and most recently a 2-year assignment with the U.S. National Security Council. So this guy understands it, certainly from the inside.
John, a lot of our conversation is focused on Iran. We mentioned North Korea there, but I want to hit on Russia a little bit, because there seems to be, at least within the international community, a tolerance for Russia having nuclear weapons that does not extend to other countries that are not necessarily allies currently of the United States. I know there's a lot of history here with the Cold War, but and also the agreements post-Cold War that the U.S. and Russia have with one another to prevent the proliferation of nuclear weapons. But why do you think the international community tolerates Russia having nuclear weapons?
I think it's a case of familiarity. Russia inherited the nuclear weapons from the Soviet Union. 3 other countries did as well, Ukraine, Kazakhstan, and Belarus. And there was a concerted effort made, led by the United States in the early days following the Cold War, to return all of those weapons to Russian control. This was one of the highest priorities of the Clinton administration back in the early 90s. And it was a case where it was seen as Russia being the responsible steward for these weapons, and it was seen as being a more desirable outcome than proliferating nuclear technology to 3 more countries. That was seen as putting a chink in the wall and allowing more countries to have nuclear weapons and possibly leading to greater proliferation in other places. Nowadays, we look back at that and say, maybe that wasn't such a good idea, but that was very much the spirit of the time.
We mentioned in our lead up to you a great read on the Bloomberg about the satellite images that reveal that President Trump's dilemma over the Iran nuclear complex. There's a lot more that needs to be done. What do we know about the damage that really has been done so far to the nuclear capabilities by Iran, and especially when it comes to non-civilian uses? What do we know about that in particular?
What we know is that Iran has been enriching uranium to levels that are not necessary for anything but weapons. That is to say, there is no benign reason to enrich uranium to the levels that Iran has been. This is what has got Israel upset. Israel, however, has chosen to use military means to address this issue. It is possible that Israel may be able to significantly degrade, destroy, disable Iran's enrichment facilities. It may be possible that should the U.S. become involved, the U.S. may be able to do more than Israel to destroy or degrade these enrichment facilities. But that is actually beside the point, because Iran can simply rebuild. Mm-hmm. It may be with considerable expense and considerable effort, but they can rebuild. They built them once, they can do it again. Maybe it will be better and more difficult to destroy the next time, but it can be rebuilt. So the military effort is all more or less a waste. It's only through diplomacy and diplomatic effort that we can get to a permanent solution in this case. Now, you'd expect that from me. I'm a career diplomat. When you interview somebody who has worn a uniform for 30 years, he's going to talk about the military means as being the only way forward, the only solution. But you're talking to a diplomat, so I'm going to feature the diplomatic means.
What is the diplomatic solution then? What, in your view, would actually stop Iran from wanting and being able to achieve a nuclear weapon?
And did we have it, the deal that President Trump pulled out of in 2018?
The deal that was done in 2015 basically blocked the pathway to nuclear weapons for Iran. And it had a robust verification mechanism so that we would know if Iran was cheating, we would know if Iran was doing something that they weren't supposed to. The problem with it was that it had a 10-year sunset provision. So under certain circumstances, after 10 years, which is say now, 2025, Iran could resume enrichment activity. And the Trump administration, the first Trump administration, didn't like that and tried to renegotiate, got a cold shoulder from Iran and from the Europeans, and decided at that point, rather than to try to fix that problem or do anything else, make another effort, to pull out. So I think you would start with something along those lines, but without that sunset provision. Certainly you could bring back most of the elements of the verification provisions in the IAEA supervision, and the confidence that gave that Iran was not conducting these activities.
Not easy. Not easy at all. Thank you so much. Really appreciate getting some time with you on this Friday. John Areth, he is Senior Policy Director for the nonpartisan Center for Arms Control and Non-Proliferation, joining us there in New Jersey.
You're listening to the Bloomberg Businessweek Daily podcast. Catch us live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern. Listen on Apple CarPlay and Android Auto with the Bloomberg Business app, or watch us live on YouTube.
Federal Reserve Governor Christopher Waller said the Fed can lower interest rates as soon as next month, reiterating his view that the inflation hit from tariffs is likely to be short-lived. Here's Governor Waller earlier today on CNBC.
Right now, the data the last few months has been showing that trend inflation is looking pretty good, even on a 12-month basis. So I've labeled these good news rate cuts when, if inflation comes down to target, we can actually bring rates down. I've been saying this since about November of 23. So I think we're in that position that we could do this and as early as July.
That's Chris Waller earlier on CNBC. I said short-lived. That was my homage to Jay Powell.
Okay.
He says short-lived.
Hey, if Jay does it, I'm good with it.
That's what I'm throwing out there.
I'm totally good with it. Hey, Peter Atwater is back with us. He's president of Financial Insights, adjunct lecturer of economics at the College William and Mary, also author of the book, The Confidence Map, Charting a Path from Chaos to Clarity. He joins us from just outside Philadelphia. It feels like right now is a perfect time to talk about what feels like, again, from chaos or a moment of chaos. Peter, it's good to have you back with us. I am curious about, as we try to game out the stuff that happens around us geopolitically, tariff wars, and so on, is all of this kind of a fool's errand in terms of trying to figure out what really is the impact ultimately on markets and how to price it in?
Well, Carol, thanks for having me today. And social media would certainly lead you to believe that. There's a whole new meme out there called "Nothing Ever Happens." And it seems to be the belief that whether it's tariffs, COVID, geopolitical events, none of it matters. And the fact that it's arising now strikes me as a really interesting moment. It sadly reminds me of what the turkey might say around the beginning of November. Nothing ever happens. and I think that's the risk that not only are investors complacent, but I sense that they're acting with impunity. And I see this in several dimensions where investors don't believe that there will ever be punishment, that there is now no downside to trading.
What do you mean by that, though? Is it because the Fed steps in? Is it because the U.S. government steps in? What's the put?
So it's a combination of puts. One is you've had repeated success where the markets have only gone up in their minds for the last 10, 15 years. You have policymaker puts on both the fiscal and monetary policy side. You also have this belief that the regime politically is not particularly willing to go against the market. In fact, just the opposite. So you had the taco trade, and you have a sense that while we may skirt the rules, there will never be any punishment for doing so.
You know, it's interesting, Peter, I keep thinking about this too. And I have to say, we know tariffs are going to be higher, right? On some level. We know supply chains are continuing to be rebuilt and brought back here. If immigration and the clampdown on immigration continues, less workers, that's going to have a cost. It does sound like there are a lot of factors that go into the U.S. economic equation that there's a good chance they're going to be different going forward.
They will be. But one of the things we know is that when we look at risks, if they are abstract to us, we will find ways to avoid them. And so what I sense is that tariffs, just like COVID, still remain abstract. People haven't experienced the consequences. And so until we get that, we can find all of these reasons to ignore it. But having said that, what is so interesting about this moment is that people are looking at these risks in the eye and laughing at them. there's a belligerent response to them that they're not going to matter. Move on.
Peter, you joined us in March, and one answer that you gave to a question that we had for you really ricocheted around. A lot of people ended up watching the clip on YouTube. You said there was a clear possibility that the U.S. becomes uninvestable under President Trump. Is it more likely now or less likely now than it was to you back in March?
It's less likely now, but I know that from a particularly foreign investor perspective, there is still apprehension about how welcome they and their money are here. And if I look at what happens in immigration and trade, we have started to see clear controls. And so we know that our policies related to labor, goods and services and capital all move as one. And so I think that there is still concern, and I think appropriately so, around what happens to capital flows in all of this.
So let's just bring it back to one of the big events of the week, and that is Fed policy. And we did play some sound from Governor Waller, Fed Governor Waller, who was on CNBC earlier today, and then talking about maybe there could be some moves in July. Do you think that, I don't know, how are you thinking about monetary policy, Fed monetary policy, and how they are kind of trying to figure out what is the right policy here and kind of factoring in all of these things that you're talking about?
Yeah, so the Fed, in their desire to be data dependent, feels compelled to wait until things are real. And so there is reluctance on the part of many participants at the Fed to act until they see the results. Having said that, I would keep an eye on the 10-year. The 10-year ultimately is going to be what leads policymakers to move up or down. And right now, you've got, they would appear to have the ability to lower rates. Some, what that really means, we'll wait and see. But they're trend following at the end of the day. The markets will always move faster than a bureaucratic committee in Washington, always.
Peter, before we let you go, on what is investable right now, listener Ryan Horan getting in touch, asking about your alternatives away from U.S. markets when Europe can't grow, in his view. His view is also that Asia is likely in a recession. He wants to know, where do you invest for capital appreciation?
So I think you have to look at commodities in this environment. One of the things we know is that when you start to encumber trade, you run the risk of goods in the wrong places and commodity prices responding to that on a local basis. And when I look particularly around food inputs, you look at rice prices, for example, we can look at current oil prices. I think that the risk is in real asset prices.
All right. Really appreciate it. Peter, thank you so much, as always. Peter Atwater, President of Financial Insights, Adjunct Lecturer of Economics at William & Mary, joining us from outside Philadelphia. And of course, we've also talked about his book, which we have talked about here on air. It is The Confidence Map, Charting a Path from Chaos to Clarity. Appreciate his input on, so much, again, coming at us. He mentioned the 10-year note, folks. We're looking at a yield of 4.37. We've seen it spike up a little bit earlier in today's session, but we're definitely off some of the earlier higher levels. 2-year note with a yield of 3.9.
This is the Bloomberg Businessweek Daily Podcast. Available on Apple, Spotify, and anywhere else you get your podcasts. Listen live weekday afternoons from 2 to 5 p.m. Eastern on Bloomberg.com, the iHeartRadio app, TuneIn, and the Bloomberg Business app. You can also watch us live every weekday on YouTube and always on the Bloomberg Terminal.